Hey Game MS students, this is Danny here, and I'm going to go over what is the difference between front end and back end. And we're bringing this up because some of the ideas we discussed when we went over ideas last time, some of them, it's important to know this concept, and it's important to know when our idea is simple and doesn't involve the back end, and when our idea is a bit more complex and it actually involves a server. So let's say we're building a bit more of a simpler app. So let's say we're building like a brick baker game. The reason I'm calling this, the reason I'm calling this simple is um, when we're playing this game, all the information is on our device and it doesn't have to leave our device. We can keep track of the high score. We can keep track of what level we're on. We can keep track of all these things, but we don't have to at any point communicate with another device. Some other ideas, let's take, for example, if we were building Instagram. If I was building Instagram, there becomes a problem if, let's say this is me. If I take a photo on my phone, how do I get it to my friend's phone, right? So the way we do this is we have a server in the middle, and all the server is it's a computer that allows us to store information. So instead of so if I take a picture and if I want my friends to have it, I send it to a server. When Jill goes to her Instagram feed, she goes to the server and says, "Hey, do any of my friends have they posted any new images?" And so this is how we build something where phones can communicate with each other. And some of the ideas we discussed involved a server. So that's why we thought we'd bring this up. So how does front end and back end play into this? Well, when we talk about front end and back end, these devices like this iOS phone that takes information and displays information, these are called front end devices, and your server is one part of the back end. Okay, so to get a bit more in depth, when we talk about front end, what we're talking is about the iOS device, an Android device, or any web browser. So any of these things, they're either called the client or the front end. When we're talking about the back end, I simplified a bit of the example when I talked about Instagram. But when we talk about the back end, we're talking about two parts. We're talking about the server, and we're talking about the database. And so what are these two things? The database actually stores all the data. So if I have an image, at some point it is going to store the data for the image. If I have Dan as a friend of Jill, that record of Dan being a friend of Jill, that is stored in the database. So what is a server? A server is the thing that we connect to. It is something that we can say, "Hey, I'm Danny. Give me Danny's Instagram feed. Hey, I'm Jill. So give me Jill's friends. Give me Jill's Instagram feed." So our backend is the part of Instagram, if we're building Instagram, that allows that is the communication layer between all our devices and Instagram, right? So if we want to save an image, we send it to the backend. It gets saved in the database. The server tells us it's Danny and we're trying to save an image, but the database actually stores the data. And then any of our friends on their Android, iOS, or web devices, they can access the image through accessing the Instagram server. So this is the difference between a front end and back end. So just first to go over some real world names that people use when they talk about front end and back end. We're using Swift, and this is the icon for Swift. Swift is used to build iOS apps. So we're just this one small piece of the development stack, and this is called the development stack because there's so many levels of these things. There's iOS, there's Android, so there's Android, and Android apps are written in Java. And there's browsers, so you can be on Safari, you can be on Chrome, you can be on Firefox, and there's even more. you can build a front end either for iOS apps, Android apps, or web apps, and web apps can be written in JavaScript. And so this is all the front end, and this is us displaying or giving our server or our backend data, right? And so what is a backend? So a backend can be made up of a bunch of different things. So these are just some common frameworks that are used to build backends. So the most common is this thing called Express. And the reason why it's most common is it's also built in JavaScript. And JavaScript is a very popular language, and it is a very simple but powerful framework, and that's why it's the most common. There are a couple other alternatives. So this is something called Django. It's written on Python. There's something called Rails that is written in Ruby, and there's something called Spring that is written in Java. These are all just alternatives of what help us build a server. And to recap what a server is, when we go and want to access information, the server is a thing that computes the logic of what we actually want to receive from our database, right? So the database just stores raw data. Depending on what question we ask our server, we get the right data back that we want to see. So if I'm Danny, and I go to my server, I will only get from the database what Danny is allowed to see or should see. And so that server controls all of that logic. So to go over the database, these are some examples of a database. So whenever you see SQL or SQL, that is probably the most common database. And so there's some examples of that. There's MySQL, there's Microsoft SQL that isn't shown, and this is called Postgres, which is SQL, which is a very common and famous. There are also some other alternatives to databases. One's called MongoDB and Redis. And so the idea with this slide is just to introduce you to some names or some common alternatives for front-end frameworks, server frameworks, and different types of databases. So to go over the most commonly used dev stack today, so if we went to a bunch of popular sites, you'd probably see this or something very similar to this. What you'd see is if you went, let's say, to the browser, you'd see, let's say we went to Reddit, you'd see Reddit uses a framework called React. And so React helps them make the web app on their browser. So we're using React for our front end. For our back end, we're using Express, which is written in no JavaScript. And we're saving the data in a Postgres SQL database. So the idea of this slide is to show you an example of in the real world. This is called, if you were building an app, and if someone asks you, what is your stack? You say, oh, I'm using React for my front end. In our example, because we're building an iOS app, we'd say, hey, I'm using Swift iOS for my front end. And in our apps, we're not going to have a backend. So we wouldn't say this. But when someone asks you for what is your stack, you can list them what you're using for your front end and your back end. And when you say you're a full stack developer, what that means is you write front end code, which is code we're learning, but then you also write back end code, which allows you to access your server and allows you to write the right queries to access the data in your database. So for game of apps, I added this slide, and what we're doing is we are only writing the iOS client, right? We're only writing the mobile app. If we have an idea that says, hey, we want to be able to communicate between phones, what we're actually going to do is we're going to mock the data. We're not actually going to build this server or database side of our app. We are going to just save all of this locally on our device and mock data just for the demo purposes. After the project, you can come back and do this. But for a game of apps, we are just going to build the client side. So good. That this is for game of apps, but once game of apps is done and you say, hey, I want to take this and I want to actually build this so that it works not just with mock data, but I can give to my friend and I can send data from my phone to their phone. A very common thing that people use for their first framework, instead of these more intense ones, is they use this thing called Firebase, and it's a product built by Google. And the idea of Firebase is they've said, hey, we're going to build the whole backend for you. Uh, we're going to make it super simple for you. You can see it. But all you have to do is implement the front end Firebase framework on your iOS or Android device and call the function save or call the function get, and you can access all of this stuff. And we're gonna do this work for you. You just have to implement this framework. So if you wanted to not mock the data but take it to the next level, one framework you can look at, one website, is Firebase, made by Google. They have a free tier that is pretty flexible, but they also have paid tiers, so be cautious of that. So good. So just to recap, the goal of today was for us to say, do we know what a server is? Okay, so hopefully yes. So the idea of a server is all it is a computing device in the middle of different mobile or web devices, right? So if we want to send data from one device to another device, the way we do that is through a server. And then the other thing we wanted to make sure we get by the end of today is, what's the difference between front end and back end? So the back end has a server, which is the logic that we use to access our database, and the database is all the data for our app. It is all the data, which is all my data, all my friends' data, everyone's data. But the server tells us what data is accessible to me, what part of the data I want to see, and stuff like that. So this whole thing is called the back end. And the front end is any iOS, Android, or web device that we use to communicate to our back end. All right, good. Well, hopefully that made sense. Thanks for your time.